Welcome back and thanks for staying with us. So let's delve deeper into some of the top stories making headlines around the world. Firstly, the draft United Nations resolution urging a ceasefire in Gaza during the month of Ramadan has now been passed in the UN Security Council amidst the ongoing strife of the people in Gaza. What's also taking place is that Russia's initiation of a significant military offensive in Ukraine, especially in the wake of last Friday's terrorist incident, while Russian authorities hint at links between the suspects and Ukraine. The United States has disputed these allegations, speaking rather of links to the IS group. Now, opponents of Russian President Vladimir Putin argue that these attacks are being exploited as a pretext to escalate the war between Russia and Ukraine. But that's not all, because we'll also scrutinize the initial outcomes of the Senegalese election with early ballot tallies, suggesting the opposition leader in that country has emerged as the favorite contender. To unpack all of this, I can't think of anybody else but Sophie Mokoena, who of course is our international news editor, joining us here in Studio 9. Great to see you as always. Thanks very much indeed.
Good morning.
For popping by. So a lot of moving parts, and let's just deal with it as I spoke about it there. Yesterday, we heard that the UN Security Council has finally moved to accepting this draft resolution for a ceasefire. But what many people don't actually speak about is that this is a ceasefire for Ramadan, which lasts just for 2 more weeks. The obvious question that comes up is, does it go far enough?
At the moment, one would say that Palestinians will have a reprieve, particularly during this month of Ramadan. That might also help in terms of ensuring that you have the humanitarian aid being delivered in Rafah, but including areas such as Gaza, where there is a huge need. However, it doesn't go far enough, as people have pointed out, that what you need right now is a permanent ceasefire. But because there's a contestation of the 2 power blocs, Russia and China. On the other hand, you have United States of America and its allies, those who are members of the Security Council with veto powers, or the P5, as we often call them. This is something to start a process that can lead to permanent ceasefire, as we know that the 2 sides, Hamas and Israel, are also engaged in talks in terms of ceasefire. And those talks are facilitated by Qatar, Egypt, and of course the United States of America and other interested parties. And therefore there's hope that this reprieve might assist to pave way for better negotiations. And however, what was disappointing yesterday, a big country like the United States of America saying that the resolution is not binding, and one is asking a question whether the ambassador of the United Nations at the United Nations...
Yes, the U.S. ambassador in the
UN.
Yes,
the U.S. ambassador to the UN.
Right.
Is she really familiar with the UN Charter and the formation of the Security Council and why it was formed and the powers of the Security Council? That is why it has got this veto power. And therefore, it was quite disturbing because America abstained, which gave way for the adoption of the resolution. But America's ally, particularly country like the United Kingdom, they voted for.
Right.
And you had then the rest of the bloc that is supporting Palestine, supporting the resolution. And therefore, now you go out to try and appease Israel by saying it's not binding. If it's not binding, why did you even waste time to participate in the deliberations?
Yeah, and it might be seen as a bit hypocritical, right? Because there's times where I'm sure the US would want these kind of resolutions to be binding. But you've touched on something else which I think is important. And
yes, you are correct. Let's go back to Gaddafi.
Right.
You'd call when that resolution was adopted in the Security Council, which led to the invasion of Libya and the killing of Gaddafi. At that time, the US wanted that resolution to be binding, even instructing the African heads of states who were sent there by the AU on the continent to try and mediate or negotiate with Gaddafi, even telling them to move away because they are going to attack because the resolution is binding. And that's where you talk about double standards.
Absolutely. What is also taking place, at least if the optics are anything to go by, is this perception that Israel is increasingly being isolated. Even the US is feeling the pressure, and that's part of the reason why they decided to abstain in a way. And I wonder whether you reckon that will make any difference, that will shift the dial for how the US has responded to the conflict in the Middle East, given the disregard, depending who you ask, they've had of the ICJ's findings, and of course the fact that in many instances they've been accused of all kinds of atrocities, including apparently bombing places where there was an agreement initially that there'd be safe ground for people in Palestine.
Both the President of the United States of America and the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, who was in the Middle East, told Israel that if they attack Rafah, America is not going to support that and will not agree to that, and there will be consequences. Therefore, you can see that America is really becoming impatient because they are going to elections, and this thing has become a burden to Biden because he wants to get as many votes as he can, particularly from the minority groups in the United States of America. And the other issue we saw yesterday, the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, even took a decision that the delegation that was supposed to meet Biden and the administration in the United States of America to talk about these issues being recalled and him canceling that meeting. And that meeting, he had asked the Minister of Defense to go to the US to engage with his counterparts. That speaks to the frosty relations as we speak based on this resolution, but it emanates from the fact that America is under pressure.
Absolutely. It comes as no surprise, of course, International Relations Minister Dr. Naledi Pandor here at home, welcoming this as a step in the right direction. Closer to home in Senegal, there's also been a lot of developments, of course, around the elections there. This has been described on Sunday, this election, as Senegal's moment of truth. And part of that is because for the first time, we didn't have an incumbent in that country on the ballot paper, paving the way, no matter how the election went, for somebody else to take over. And it seems this opposition figure is headed from jail right possibly to the presidential house.
Credit to the youth in Senegal, which is a trend on the continent right now. The continent, the population of the continent, majority is young people. And these changes are bound to happen. You look at the registration in South Africa for these coming elections. For the first time, the youth, they went out in numbers to go and register. To get them to the polling station is another issue. Right. But this is the trend, and that's what happened in Senegal. And therefore, this person, who is likely going to be a president very soon, is 44 years old. He was appealing to the young people. And therefore, this speaks to young people on the continent. They must know that they cannot sit at home and moan in relation to the challenges they have. They have power to do things that they can be of benefit to them, including exercising their right to vote. And they can change the system. And that's exactly what he has done. And I think many countries that will be going to elections on the continent are now looking at what's happening. It started in Lesotho, the prime minister, young people behind him. You go to Malawi, it was the same issue, Zambia and Kenya. Also now in Senegal. And therefore it looks like it is true that the youth on the continent have decided to stand up, participate, and go and vote for a candidate they think will address their needs, because they are unemployed, majority of them in all countries. And they are indeed a group of people that leaders don't care to address their concerns. And this is now playing itself in terms of them saying, now we will get people who will do that. But when you look at other countries, I must say some of those leaders that got support from the young people have disappointed the young people. But this time around, because this is a young person, maybe things might be different.
Yeah, and I suppose we'll have to wait and see. I mean, there was also real concerns about this transition that might happen and whether or not it'd be peaceful. But it seems, by and large, I mean, some of his political opponents have already come out to congratulate him even before the final results are announced.
I think when we spoke to the former South African President Mbeki 2 weeks ago, he pointed out that Senegal is the most stable democracy on the continent, something that perhaps we didn't pay attention to. And that in West Africa, you've had all those countries in West Africa experiencing a removal of government by military or by force. But it has never happened in Senegal. And therefore, when the restlessness started last year, he spoke to Macky Sall this year to say, allow the democratic process to take place because you are a shining example. We want to continue to learn from Senegal. And therefore, after the ruling by the Constitutional Committee that elections must go ahead, when he wanted Macky Sall to postpone elections, and then he started even pardoning. Remember, this guy was in prison. And the other one, Usman Song, and allowing them to come. And they came, they contested elections, and the will of the Senegalese is prevailing, even though we are still waiting for the Electoral Commission to make official results. But you have pointed out that Amadou Ba, who was the main contender from the governing party coalition, has been able to congratulate Faye. And also the current president, the outgoing president, Macky Sall, has done the same yesterday. And that led to the prospective president or the person who might be a president addressing the nation last night and talking about it can't be business as usual, speaking the language of other leaders, even though they came through military coup in West Africa, all those young generals saying it's time for France to really know that it can't continue to dictate terms in Senegal.
Absolutely. From prison to president, I can already see some of the books being written. That's the time we have for today. Thanks very much indeed for helping us think through these very important issues. And I imagine we'll have a whole lot more time to unpack what's taking place also in Europe with Russia as well. But there's plenty on the go. Sophie Mokoena, of course, is SABC News' international desk editor.